The ACN podcast is made possible thanks to the generosity of our listeners and sponsors, including the Agile Alliance. As a nonprofit membership organization, the Agile Alliance is an excellent resource to help you along your Agile journey. To learn more about the Agile Alliance and our other sponsors, as well as how you can become a sponsor or supporter of our show, please visit acnpodcast.org for more information. And thank you for your support. Good morning and good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Agile Coaching Network. My name is Ray Arell. I'm one of the hosts of this monthly podcast that is now up to episode 83, which I would have never imagined that we would have gotten to 83 episodes, but through the goodness of everyone that's here, we're approaching pretty close to over 150,000 downloads, which is really cool. I always enjoy looking at those numbers and seeing that people are hitting the like button and finding value in this podcast. So welcome. This is how I love to spend my Fridays. Hopefully some of you, I see some of the regulars that are here consistently, and I appreciate you coming on board and allowing us to help you on your Agile journey. I'm joined with a set of other hosts, Shauna, Deanna, Jorg, Sheila Eckhart, and Sheila McGrath. The goal here is to hear all of the perspectives from people across the Agile community. Some of us here have been doing Agile for close to 20 years. That's a long time to be doing Agile, but it is not just about the people doing Agile for this long. We want a diverse conversation. So if you're brand new to Agile and you are wanting to share your perspective as a new person to our community, we welcome that. So join us at our monthly live events and add your voice to our podcast. If you like this podcast and you've been a long-time listener, we do appreciate if you want to go over and become a supporter of the show. You can do that multiple different ways. You can go to acnpodcast.org and see how you do that. And we appreciate all of the people who've supported us. Thank you. Last little note is that for the people who have been listening to us for a long time, if you want to have direct interaction with ACN hosts, most of us are going to be facilitating over at the Strategic Agility Lab in Portland, Oregon on October 26th and 27th. And it's a leadership retreat. It's a 2-day event. It's limited to less than 100 people. The goal is to get lots of interactions talking about things around strategic agility within organizations. And so these are a little bit more advanced topics. The goal is to strike up a multi-day event where we can network and really, for us, including myself, how do we sharpen our pencil a little bit and understand ways that we can improve the strategic agility within organizations, and how do we approach that? And so this is both yet a networking event of like-minded people who are all working on this particular type of area and segment of Agile, and we welcome you to come join us. It's going to be at a pretty cool venue over here in Portland, known as the Kennedy School, which is an old school environment where we're going to set up in the old high school gym, which will be pretty cool. But you're welcome to go take a look at strategicagilitylab.org and see what we've got going there. To kick us off today, we had a question a few podcasts ago, and I think we spent very sort of the back end time of the hour talking about it. But looking back through the archives, we actually haven't talked about what do we do when we just first get started with a new team or a new organization. And specifically, if we are the coach coming in, the person who has been invited to the team or invited to talking to senior leadership or helping to educate senior leadership or even try to change the processes around senior leadership, the approach that we take as a coach, getting started, those first days and weeks that we start integrating with these teams. The question originally that was from a few podcasts ago is, how do I start that? How do I get that going? What are the different ways that I go off and look at this monumental complexity of how do I get a group of people going on Agile? And as from complexity theory space and all of that, you're going to have a different set of people within that organization that are going to have different opinions that might either help you that might help to accelerate your adoption, or you might have, as we've talked about on other previous podcasts, you might have a team that's been damaged by maybe some prior attempt of Agile that unfortunately taints the pool. So it makes it hard to move forward quickly with them because you're having to go repair some of that damage that's around there. Now, if you all remember the Tuckman model, and whether or not you agree with the model or not, I'm just throwing this up here as a talking point to get the conversation going. All teams that when you insert a new player, you're basically throwing the team back into a forming phase. So any new player at any particular time could set you back to this sort of pre-staging and forming. And then once you start to have those conversations, once you start to go through and try to move the team towards norming and performing, you go through this storming phase. And storming is not everyone yelling at one another. It's really just a set of ideas that might be divergent from one another. And you're trying to come together on a way to get the team to go link together and effectively move forward as a team on the goal of whatever you're trying to go adopt, deliver, or what you are trying to improve. And if you look at the bottom of this one chart that I'm just throwing up here, there's a sense of this sort of dependence mode, meaning that people with more knowledge are feeding that knowledge to the group, and then a set of independence, which is people just working by themselves. They're not really working as a team. The goal is that we want to try to move teams towards interdependency, meaning that we're going to rely on one another. We all have different skills. Those skills help to go build a great team. That as well as the diversity in the team helps to make better decisions. The other thing with this, and I'm throwing this back in to talk about the catastrophic path that sometimes occurs here. The fruitful path of getting from the existing current state to the desired state that we want to get to as a team. I think it's been very seldom in my career that I found that I got with a team that we didn't hit some form of anxiety, or that management was setting some unrealistic goal, or maybe that the fact that the teams are larger and I'm only one coach that can go spread across maybe 5 to 10 teams. There's always things and reasons in the environment that cause us not to get to that current state that we want to get to. And in fact, maybe the thing falls apart for just a little bit. The questions as we go through thinking about it for this, and I definitely want to get everyone's impressions of this, is that I want to see a couple things if we can answer this today, which is, number one, what is your approach as a new coach to a team or an organization? What do you do in those first early days of your transition into those teams? How do you approach that? Secondary to that, what have been your biggest issues that you've dealt with as coming in as a new coach? And what steps did you take to go address those problems? I know I went through a lot there, and I know my co-hosts always kick me a little bit because I always give them a lot of things to unpack. But let's go ahead and get started. Shauna, did you want to go take a first attempt at this?
Absolutely. So this is a topic you can start in a lot of different places. I think I'm going to focus, having worked primarily in software development, I think that when most teams that I've worked in, we're not starting Agile from the beginning. It's already at a certain place within organizations. What typically happens is that teams have to reform. Maybe the team know where people are coming from and we're forming new teams because maybe there was a layoff or a project stopped. Maybe there's an immediate priority because people have been pulled out of other teams and they've left their team. We're going to form a new team in order to get this new priority done. Maybe similarly, you can think of an immediate priority as a new feature, a new product, or maybe there's a security breach or we've got new regulations coming in. A lot of times teams are not always brought together under the best of conditions. And because of that, what I find is that motivation is down from the beginning. And so as a coach coming in, what I often try to do is to meet the team where they're at, try to figure out recognize we're here. We didn't always choose to form this team. This is really important to the business. And so setting context is critical. So just like we do project kickoffs and bringing people together, I think that doing team forming is just as equally as important. Spending time to get to know each other, taking the team out or doing something so that we can understand. Just tell me a little bit about yourself. Set context. Why are we here? Why is this important for the business? What's the mission we're going to go on? What are the metrics that we care about? What does this team own? And even having those conversations as you're kicking off the team. But most importantly, I think creating those working agreements in a workshop so that you can agree, the team together gets to build how they have conversations. How do we communicate? What is the timing of our ceremonies? When do we get to celebrate? What does definition of done look like? And really giving the team an opportunity to define how they want to work together instead of having somebody come in and tell them, we're doing Agile, this is how we're doing things. I already have your board set up, and that never goes well. I think that when I see teams immediately go into kind of those storming phases, it's because they don't agree with how things are being run within the team. Maybe they have expectations because they're coming from another team. And this typically works really well and in setting the team up from the beginning. Where you may have challenges is when somebody new kind of gets brought in after the team already goes through those exercises. You do have to spend a moment to bring that new person in. But that's how I always approach it, because I think it's really important to level set everybody from the very beginning.
So question for you is not everyone in the room is the type A's, the ones who will jump in, offer their opinion, just willing to speak their mind. There's some people who are not in that space. Is there a strategy that you use to make sure that you hear the entire room?
It's very similar to a retrospective, because I see retrospective as another workshop in order to get folks talking and learning together. And same thing, if you find that maybe they're not quite comfortable, start off slow and pull just a couple of these, maybe do, whether it's virtual whiteboarding or sticky noting, have people just write down their thoughts and then spend some time going through them. I think if people are looking for a safe space or they're not comfortable speaking out loud, I think it's really up to the coach or facilitator to still make sure that everybody feels heard in whatever context that looks like.
Okay, thank you for that. Scott, your hand went up. What do you have on this?
Yeah, I love the previous comments. Those are excellent. And it brought me back to Ray, something you mentioned earlier. Sometimes I'll take the Tuckman model or the Drexler Civet model, and I'll actually show that to the team so that they're aware of the journey that they're about to go on and some of the things that they may think are unnatural, but are actually quite common amongst teams, just to make them aware. And then same thing that was just mentioned, trying to meet the team where they're at and trying to use the frameworks like Scrum or Kanban or whatever you happen to be using. We want them to be empirical and be able to use data to make decisions. So I try to go really slow in the beginning and let the team come to me and say, this isn't really working well for us, or this isn't really working well, and then try to help them find ways to make those things better. And they tend to gravitate towards me a little bit easier because I'm not forcing anything on them. I'm letting the data drive the decision making. I'm letting them drive what they want to talk about and what sources of dissatisfaction they're witnessing and want to try to address.
So interesting point. So you're really, I think both Shauna and yourself are taking the approach of empowerment. How do I empower this team to uptake, to bring stuff in? Is there any other strategy that you use, Scott, in order to make people feel empowered? Do you tell them, hey, you guys are empowered, or do you do this sort of in an indirect way?
So we do talk about self-organization, self-managing, and concepts like extreme ownership. We also do exercises like moving motivators. We also do exercises like personal journey lines and how do you see yourself relating to the other folks on the team. And as folks share that, they start to get a better understanding around how they see themselves and why they see themselves that way. Or moving motivators. What motivates you versus somebody else on the team, and having those conversations. All driving towards, I think, in the previous comments, we're heading towards trying to create a container of psychological safety where the team will actually have honest conversations with themselves, to the point where maybe there's a little bit of angst. And as a coach, you have to manage that, obviously, but you usually get to a better solution at the end.
Sure. I appreciate all those comments. Sheila, what do you have on this?
I've gone into organizations where it wasn't as cut and dried as that. The first thing I always need to find out, I think, is it a dedicated team? Because a lot of times they should be, but they're not. Because they think they're doing Agile, or maybe just one department is experimenting with Agile. So you really have to investigate the organization and where they are with Agile and whether they have a stable approach to it. Like if they believe they are doing Agile throughout the organization, are they following a specific framework or more than one? Are departments or projects allowed to choose what they're going to follow? Are they adapting it an awful lot of companies do something where they say, this is our flavor, and they pick and choose from different frameworks. And also different teams may be doing something entirely different. So you need to find out what they're doing and find out what their understanding is. So one of the things I want to know that's not always easy to find out is, does management really think that they need to be involved in this, or are they just saying, make it so to the people below? And that makes it a little more challenging to help them to understand what Agile is and what their role in it is. And also, what do they think transformation means? Because a lot of times I've talked to a lot of coaches who have said that they go into an organization and somebody says, make us Agile, transform us in 2 months, which is obviously not realistic. So you need to know where your starting point is. Another thing I like to find out in the organization, is it strictly within IT? Are you working with teams outside of IT? Does finance understand Agile? Do they understand the difference between Agile and waterfall? What about HR? Do they understand? And then with the team, if it's a newly formed team, or even if it's not, where did they learn about Agile? What do they think when they're talking about Agile? What do they think it means? And usually you find out that they all think something different. But what I've found a lot of times is within IT, the team will think that the sponsor and the product manager report to the Scrum Master. And they also get confused about what the roles are, that the Scrum Master should tell the product owner or product manager, depending on the organization, what stories to write and how they should be written. And there are a lot of things that they get confused about. So you need to find out what they know by just asking, what do they understand? And that's a whole education in itself, because usually no two think the same thing. You also need to find out about what the organization's past history is. I've gone into organizations where they said Agile doesn't work for us, but whatever they'd done that they're describing wasn't really Agile. And depending on what answers you get to these basic questions, then you try to map out a plan of which things are the most critical to success that we tackle first. And then all the things that Shauna and Scott said apply. I think that's where I would start.
Sure. It's interesting because the original 12 principles, when they were published, and I think Alistair Cockburn reposted one of these drafts. And I wish they would have left it this way as the original set that they did, because the draft actually had this slanted towards customers, and they had like about 4 of the values slanted towards what the customer should care about with the Agile set. But they had the middle block, which is slanted towards managers, like things like build projects around motivated individuals, or the most effective method is face-to-face communication. And those principles were not intended to go towards the team. They were intended to say, managers, you need to embrace these things. And I think it's interesting that somewhat got lost when you just lumped them all together as 12. One thing that I wanted to pick up on what you were saying, though, too, was this getting everyone on the same page, the unlearning process of bad stuff, wrong information, and all those things. How do you approach that? Do you just come out and say, that's not what it is? Or do you use a different technique to help to get them to the right knowledge?
Well, for myself, I don't usually try to tell them they're wrong. I just tell them it's interesting. And what about if we look at it from a different perspective or things like that? Or it's interesting, that's the way it was done in your old organization. But my understanding is the way we want to proceed here is, and then talk about whatever I think the differences are between their understanding and what we're planning to do, or a good Agile approach. And it's usually a give and take. Now, the thing that you were talking about with face-to-face is, I can't remember the last time the team that I was working with, or any of the teams that I was working with, were all co-located.
Right.
Even if I go back to the late 80s, we might have all been in the same city, but we weren't in the same building, and I had to get in a car and drive to get to the rest of the team. There was always a certain amount of not being faced to make everything work. And I think that's gotten easier with things like Zoom and Teams and other tools that people use, and whiteboarding and those kinds of things. But from my perspective, that was it. Usually now I'll be working with teams, some of which are offshore. And sometimes we have to adjust schedules to find a time when everybody's awake and awake enough. I've had that even when everybody was co-located, though, too, because on some types of work, you really have 24/7 shifts, depending on what it is and the urgency, and their handoffs. Any kind of stand-ups or anything like that you're trying to schedule, you have to look and see, when will most people be awake enough to participate and actually retain things, and not get into bickering, which happens when people are tired, and it's a complicated subject, which it's always a complicated subject. Unless you're just, and there's no point really in my mind in having the meeting where you say, no blockers, the old 3 questions, where you do, what have you accomplished, what are you going to accomplish, and do you have any blockers? And everybody uses it as an opportunity to grandstand a little, and then says no blockers, even though they've got 5 blockers. The other thing is that usually you have to, especially with the quieter team members, I've always found that you have to find a way to talk to them separately and encourage them to speak up. And I think the other thing that I try to do is try to find ways that they can participate without having to be confrontational, which it depends on the organization and the team structure, what you can do.
Agreed. The manifesto hasn't changed since 2001. They left it as a static document. Think about what the technology was in 2000. And I think I was carrying around a BlackBerry. I think I was, but there was no such thing as camera phones. There was a lot of the different technology that was there. It was pretty primitive in a lot of regards. I think I was still dropping inner office memo envelopes around that period of time. So for you young kids, we used to go back and forth in the snow both ways to work. But I do actually, one thing I do miss is I used to miss the fact that when a meeting ended and I had to go across campus, I got to get a walk. You never scheduled a meeting right after each other. And I think in the Zoom land that we're currently in, we're in the space of, Oh my goodness. I've got to just jump from call to call. I think so. This is a different set of problems that we have today. Let's see. Joanna, you raised your hand. What do you have?
Sheila was mentioning reaching out to each person individually, and that reminded me as when I join a team, if I'm joining an existing team, after I've introduced myself to everyone as a whole, and hopefully describe some ways that I want to be able to support them as a group, then I go and I follow up the one-on-ones to introduce myself individually to each person on the team. And during that time, I then go back and I ask them what is their interpretation of what I've described as what I hope to see my role to be with them, and then ask them what they hope that I'm going to be able to help them with. And so that gives us a chance to not only do a little bit of like expectation setting, but also elicit some of the pain points that they might be seeing and might not feel comfortable otherwise bringing up as a group. So I can, have a better understanding of the opportunities that they're seeing, but also really work on building relations as individual humans, as opposed to I'm just coming in and filling this role in this team. And we all have to say everything in front of each other all the time. Sometimes, like Sheila was saying, giving some of the quieter people a space to speak up on their own or giving them just a different avenue can really help build that relationship.
As people share these concerns that they have, how do you track those? Because I think the worst thing that could happen is that you share things with people and still nothing changes. And so people might dig in and be more resentful now that they've shared it with you if it doesn't see that it's getting addressed. So I'm curious how you approach that.
Yeah, it's really delicate because the other thing that I tell people is the conversations that I have with people one-on-one, I try to hold in as much confidence as I can. I don't want them to tell me something in a one-on-one, and then the very next meeting we go back and we talk about it in front of the entire group. Especially if it's something very particular, then it could be something that sort of, outs someone as having an issue that they didn't feel comfortable bringing up in front of the group. I usually just try to keep an eye on some of those things over time and look for patterns that develop. Because usually if one person is seeing it, someone else is seeing it too. And then if I can collect those data points to find the pattern behind it, if that really exists, then it's easier to approach that way. And then after having that initial one-on-one, you get a sense for who wants to talk to you more than just that once. Sometimes I'll have standing one-on-ones with people either every other week or maybe once a month just to check in. And then also if it's something that I'm keeping an eye on, looking for a pattern or looking for a solution for, just reaching back out to them and saying, hey, I remember that we talked about this thing a couple of weeks ago. This is what I've been seeing about it. These are some ideas that I'm working on in my head, and just know that it hasn't fallen off my radar.
So let me take this to a slight extreme. And this is something I think coaches get stuck in a lot, probably more often than what's talked about, is that when an issue comes up that is much larger, that really maybe crosses into the realm of an HR issue or something that needs to be alerted to management, something that is beyond just the standard improvements of the team. How do you approach that? What's your pathway for that? And how do you, from not blocking trust in a particular with that individual, how do you approach that?
So thankfully, I personally haven't been in one of those situations yet. So I don't have enough experience to speak to this point on that, but maybe somebody else in the group does, and I can learn from them.
Okay, thank you for that. Let's see, Alirezi?
So yeah, I think the first thing I wanted to say and add to the comments that everyone else said is my most important issue with the new team is the Dunning-Kruger effect. And the paradox between that and then understanding everyone is talented, everyone is resourceful, and then try to find the balance, what we should do to resolve that. Because especially a Scrum, when it comes to teams, it says it's only 13 pages. It's very easy. It's very lightweight. You don't need to know anything. That gives the idea to people that you go and read that guide and then that's it. And then the hardest time is to help them understand Agile is behind that and And I gave up on that. Instead, I find very small goals that I find that I need to help the team to understand a little bit more and move forward as they come up. I think you had a question about how empowering the team, for example, and it's an example of what I just said earlier is, for example, we go to a retrospective and they mention something. I make sure that thing happens as soon as possible and then bring the results to them and show them that it actually worked. Or we do surveys but we make sure that we actually very intentionally show them, here is the survey results that you did, here is the action these two leads made, and this is what happened. So that way we make sure they see it in action versus doing a bunch of, also activities are important. Helping them understand is important, but showing them in practice is very important. And of course, the first thing that I do in a very small team is the planning poker. That's the place they find out what they say is important, at least toward the product. That's what I wanted to add there. And then one other thing I want to say is my approach is usually being not too ambitious. I usually use the example of doing a workout. You don't want to put too much weight when you're doing a workout, but you don't want to go too light. So find a way that you push yourself and like with the team, push a little bit, but then you come back. So you cross that line. So we feel a little bit of that we need a little bit to put more, but then you come back. So you let it release. So a shock and release strategy. That's been my approach. It seems to be working in most of the cases. Of course, there are cases that it doesn't work.
I like the analogy there because I think that we're stretching people, helping them to come into practice, and it's literally practicing these different types of techniques. And sometimes they're going to work and sometimes they're not. So I really appreciate that as a way of approach. Deanna, what do you have on this side?
Gosh, all this conversation has been taken my head in so many different directions, and I really appreciate all the things that people are saying. And this is when you talk to the author of Retrospectives, and then Liftoff, and then the 5 Rules of Learning, and then the Agile Fluency. We're in my sweet spot with this conversation here. So I've been loving all the different perspectives that people have been sharing and techniques because they're all really wonderful. I guess the one thing that I would add that maybe I haven't heard yet is definitely, as the author of Liftoff, I definitely have a bias toward giving the team some time when they first come together to get their act together, to decide who they want to be, how they want to work, all the things that Sean has said and Sheila said, and I think Scott, everybody has talked a bit about that. But the one part of that I haven't heard yet is, in addition to talking to every team member and so on, and getting to know something about the organization, I want to know who are the touch points for the team in the rest of the organization. Who is their product owner, if they're using Scrum, or their product manager or product development officer, I've heard also as a term. I want to know who is the team working in conjunction with. And who's helping the team understand the business direction and so on. And I want to get to know as much about that as I can as well up front, because that helps me help that person clarify their product vision and their idea about how the team will be working, and give them some feedback on that idea if it seems too wacky or anti-agile or whatever. I'm not so worried about non-agile. I am worried about anti-agile. So I want to suss that out a bit. Do they have an engineering manager that the team is reporting to, or is there an engineering manager and a QA manager and a business analysis manager and what does that structure look like, to have a sense of the context that the team is working in? And so along with those things, then I can, if I'm going to go in and do a lift off with some agile, some team chartering and so on, I have a place to start around, okay, so what I understand is this is the purpose that your organization has brought you together for. Does that match your understanding as a team or as the individuals? When I interview each individual, I agree with Johanna and Sheila about that as well. So I want to get some sense of that context and some sense of the complexity and conflicts and controversies that may exist in that context, because that helps me to begin to prepare myself for what I may need to bring to this team. And I tend to not work directly with software teams anymore, but I may be working with their team of managers or their leadership team at some level in the organization. And so I need to know the same things for them as I needed to know before as a coach to a software team, or a coach to a scrum master of a software team, or those kinds of things. So I tend to come in at a little different level, but I think the approach is the same. And I really appreciated you starting us off with the Tuckman model. And I know it's been debunked in all kinds of ways, but I do think it points to a truism, which is when a group of people first come together to do work together, their very first task is to decide whether or not they can trust each other enough to start doing the work. And so that getting to know you part, and that who's got what skills, and that sort of those initial co-intelligence building activities, I think are so critically important, no matter where you are in the organization or what work group or team of people that you're working with.
I agree with that. I think that Maslow's hierarchy of getting it incorrect, probably needs
Thank you. Hierarchy. Yeah.
Needs hierarchy,
Yeah.
but the safety portion of it.
Yeah.
And I think that a lot of teams that I go into, safety is questionable. And so to get to those higher order things, you really have to go address, what's taking place? Why do people feel unsafe? Or in the case of very hierarchical, I'm thinking specifically about one of my older companies that I used to work with, the ranking and rating process of how people are measured sort of undermines sometimes the safety, because we're trying to build teams, but yet you have another contradictory system that's building individuals. And so you find that people get stripped away of their team identity for their personal identity all the time, especially once a year. And so you find that it becomes more like it becomes more of a competition between the players than a teamwork between the players. So yeah, that's never good. One other thing too, is you were talking about working at that next level up with managers and their group. What do you see as though, if you think about the deliverable shift that happens in management, you now are delegating out to a product owner, you're delegating to the team. There's certain roles that you used to play that you don't have to go do that anymore because these other people are empowered. What do you find as being the biggest challenge in that space?
I think one of the biggest challenges is to help people who have been so used to functioning in leadership silos, to get them to understand how working laterally with their peers is important for greater effectiveness in their organization. Sometimes folks get that, sometimes they don't. Sometimes, a number of times I've recommended that to a group of folks and then they say, oh no, we don't need to do that. And then 6 months or 8 months or a year later, they come back and they say, we've had this idea. We think we should form some kind of a steering committee or team or something to help the software teams or the development teams do what they need to do. So I just say, oh, what a good idea. And then we go forward with that. But I do think that is one thing, that's a hurdle that's tough for people to get over. They can see, even when they see the value of their direct reports working in a team-based structure which could be a little bit of a hurdle in itself. It's even more difficult for them to figure that they might need to do that, and the value of the co-intelligence they can build by doing that. I think that's one of the biggest issues that comes up.
Thank you for that. Manzi, what do you have on this?
So when Joanna was talking about working with the teams and the one-on-ones, and you asked the question about how do you handle a situation when something that needs to be escalated to HR or is more a challenge at an organizational level, how you manage that, and then how do you track these concerns that you're hearing from the teams, because they can come back and say, you knew this was a problem, what have you done about it, sort of thing. I think I take that back to what your coaching stance is when you're meeting with these teams. I think it's important to be very transparent about your style of working. Like in my personal experience, like I know I can be quite direct and I am a go-getter. So when I have to go tackle a problem, let's say I've identified a trend, it's important for me in those dialogues to make it known to people, to the team members, that here is how I go about solving the problem if you're looking to me to help solve for the problem. And that's not to say that you're going to put those teams in uncomfortable positions, but instead you want to be the ambassador to take these problems to a different level to help solve for it. If you have larger teams, you can't expect all 30 people to raise their hands and speak up. Everybody has their own view to the challenge and they will look at it differently. They might look at it from a point of mindset, which is you're talking about yourself, or it could be something about the practices, it could be the environment, it could be team culture. There's so many elements to it, the same problem. So I think that making your stance transparent is your approach when you find yourselves in, or you're needed by the team to go help solve for a problem or bring a group of people to collectively solve for a problem. I think that becomes very critical to make that known. And then it becomes easier for you to take the dialogue wherever it needs to go, how far it needs to be escalated, or if anybody from higher up needs to be a part of that conversation to help solve for that problem. So I just wanted to share that part when you brought up that HR situation, something I've personally been in, so I could relate and thought I would share that with you.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I think disclosure you're doing about here is how I approach things. I think that is incredibly vital. I can tell you that Ray 2.0 and Ray 3.0 and Ray 4.0, through those transitions, I always leaned into the teams and let them know these are the things that I'm developing for myself, my skills. And I found that always worked much better. And then, of course, Ray 2.0 was a pretty blunt guy. Literally, let's skip the middle parts and just get to blunt. And that letting people know what your style is, I think at least allows people to understand whether or not that fits. And also being open to the fact that if it doesn't work for you, we all manage people differently. I can bend and be, if I go to an Agile conference, I can hug a lot of people, but that's typically something I don't do on the street because I'll get arrested. Thank you for all of that. I appreciate that. Let's see, we have time for one more comment. Let's see, Tutu?
Yes, how we communicate the training of a new coach to a team or organization is really important. So I had an incident, a situation in my early days as a coach where I was silently introduced to people, to the team, that I don't know how that came off, but during one-to-one with some of the team members, someone said, "Oh, are you here to whip up into shape?" I'm like, "Whip you into shape?" So he said, "Yes, that's what is going on around," and that's what they understood, that they're not doing so well, so they're bringing somebody in to whip them into shape. I immediately was met with a lot of defensiveness, a lot of silence, and stonewalling. They were just like, let's see how she succeeds. Communication is very key in introducing a new coach to a team or to an organization. How you communicate that change. Change itself is a challenge as it is. So now having a greater impact when how when and what they're supposed to do, what that coach is supposed to do on the team is now heightened with insinuations from outside or from wider teams. For managers, managing the teams within the organization, you have apart from being a coach, you have managers that manage individual people on the teams. That was my experience. And for me to get over that, I needed to build trust. And just like the last speaker mentioned, I needed to assure the team and tell them my style and get them comfortable with who I am, introduce a lot of one-to-one into the mix. And with that, I was able to, it took time than it should have not necessarily taken, but we got there at last. And by the time I exit the team, I had a good relationship with a bunch of them. Yeah, if it had been handled better at the start, I wouldn't have had a lot to go through in my days. That's my experience. Thank you.
No, thank you for sharing that. I think cultures sometimes within companies, I've worked for a lot of expert-based cultures where they don't care if you're an expert at their particular thing that they're working on. They just want to see that you're an expert in something. And the expert cultures tend to be sometimes toxic, meaning that we're no longer talking to you because we don't perceive you as an expert, the types of experts that we acknowledge. And I think in that particular case, it's very helpful to have proxies, meaning people who are going to speak and vouch for you, your skills and your abilities and what you've done, rather than you having to go read through your own resume, others who are going to support you. And again, I think sometimes it comes down to the coalition of the willing, which is we're going to work with people who are wanting our help, and others we're be patient. And sometimes that patience will pay off. And I've had laggers in Agile sometimes come back around and they become the biggest advocates that I've ever seen, just because of just having patience with them, because acknowledging that's where they were at. We are at the top of the hour. This was a great conversation today. I want to thank everyone who contributed, thank everyone who's here listening today. And I think that overall, I think this is a subject that we could probably spend a day on, just coming up with different ways and approaches of the start. But this, I think, is a lot of great information for people. So I thank you for sharing that. Our next live event is going to be on September 22nd. And September 22nd happens to be my birthday. So you guys, I'm going to violate something that I don't normally do, which is working on my birthday. I'm actually going to come in and do this podcast because I enjoyed doing this podcast. But anyway, with that, I hope you guys all have a great month. Be sure to reach out if you go over to acnpodcast.org. There are some forums up there if you want to go interact with us. You're also welcome at any time to send an email. And if you need me to connect you to any of the co-hosts or any of that, just let me know in the email. We're here, we're available. A lot of us like to do mentoring, so just let us know. And with that, I hope you guys enjoy the rest of your, if you're in your summertime, that you're enjoying the rest of that summer. And also if you're on the opposite side of the planet, you're enjoying the remainder of the winter season. So with that, everyone, have a great month. The ACN podcast is for educational and informative use only. If you'd like to know more about the ACN community, please come up to acnpodcast.org and support our show.